There we go. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is another episode of Applied Virtue Podcast. Today I have on a special guest named RJ. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, RJ?
Okay, my name is RJ Shaw, and I have moderate sized YouTube channel called The Fourth Age. I also produce crowd-funded comics and graphic novels. I have a couple of graphic novels out right now. One is called The Valiant Heroes. The other is called Thomas Valiant. Both of those are available on Indiegogo, and I have another one that is coming up within about 6 months. So in this summer, basically a fantasy story. It's called Crom the Destroyer. So I try to center my channel and what I produce around the idea of hero, the idea of a virtuous hero, the traditional idea of a hero. I usually on my videos, when I talk on the fourth age, I go over at the very least to the background of what I'm talking about, the culture war, and a lot of different kinds of pop culture, but I always tie it back to ancient ideas or medieval ideas, ideas of virtue, ideas of heroism that have been around for millennia. And that's what I built my channel originally around, and that's where my graphic novels grew out of.
Sounds good. I am a bit of a big fan of your channel, and I hope to one day uh, get the money to purchase some of your graphic novels. I'm thinking about doing so soon. By the way, if you ever want to purchase any of RJ's material, the links are in the description. Everyone, go and check them out. Tell me, your channel is named The Fourth Age. Why is that? Where did you come up with that name?
Well, like I said, I wanted to, from the very beginning, center my channel around the idea of hero. And I find that a lot of people today, they just can't understand. They don't have the intellectual training to understand the heroic ideals as expressed by the medievals because they're extremely heady and tied in with a lot of other kinds of ideas. So I went back to the Greeks because I have a liberal arts education, several degrees. One of them is in classics. And I thought to myself, okay, I want to go back to ideas that people would understand more because a lot of people do have liberal arts degrees, so they can understand Greek and Roman ideas probably better than medieval ideas right now, especially in our culture. And so the idea in Greek mythology is that the fourth age is the age of heroes. And as I said, I wanted to center my channel around the concept of hero. So I thought, what better name to call it than the fourth age?
That sounds honestly, that is I did not expect that answer. I thought it would have had to have done I thought it would have had something to do with the four, say, the four ages of comic books. Like there's the golden age of comic books, the silver age, the bronze age, and so on.
Well, that does tie into it. It is a happy coincidence that they both sort of dovetail there. But now, mostly, it was because of the old or not Celtic, but Greek myth. I'm very much into myth. I'm one of those people who sits down and reads encyclopedias of mythology and reads Greek myth in the Greek if I can possibly do it. It takes me a long time because I'm not that very good at Greek. I usually use the Loeb Classic Library so I can have the English there next to me. But that's the kind of thing I like to do in my spare time.
Oh wow. I used back in the day, I was a huge fanatic of Greek mythology. I grew up on the Greek myths as a kid. I just read read these like you. I read these encyclopedias and in these articles and these stories about Greek mythology, the different heroes and legends of those stories. Um, Now, I will say that when you look at some of these older stories, you do find um, what you might call heroes or gods engaging in what might be called what a lot of modern people would say is immoral behavior. In fact, there were arguments going back to Plato saying that the stories of the Homeric myths might have to be censored because they might be impious or immoral. What would you say in response to those people?
I would say that the idea of hero did evolve, definitely. If you can, I would say you can go all the way back to the Mycenaeans and the early Greek period where you have the tales of Homer. They had a concept of heroes being paragons of virtues, but those ideas of the virtues, even though they laid them down, even the ancient Greeks, in the same basic pattern, at the very least, as we call now the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, they had those nailed down, certainly well nailed down by the time of Plato and Aristotle. But again, the understanding and the definitely the common understanding of how virtues worked and how they infiltrated people's lives and affected them through habit and whatnot was not understood very well, at the very least, in the sense that we understand them, certainly the way that the medievals understood them, because, as I said, there's a growing understanding and definitely the concept, I think, of Augustine with his redefinition of the will. That would be key in understanding the virtues as we understand them today. And the Greeks didn't understand that. The Greeks had a completely different idea of what the will was and how the will worked and how it was affected. Because Augustine says, it's all on you. It's your choice. But you go back to the Greeks, and they're talking a lot about, Ate and Moira and a lot of these bigger forces that would control your life. And so your will, to some extent, is not your own. You have a lot in life and you got to follow it, although that does carry on to medieval thinking within the ancient Greeks with these other cultural ideas and a not so pure idea of the will. It led to a corruption of the ideas of the virtues themselves. And I think we can see that a lot more in the Romans than in the Greeks.
Hmm. So I would also add that um, even if a character in a particular a mythological work, even if a character like that were to behave poorly, that doesn't mean necessarily that the work itself ceases to be virtuous, because heroes can have flaws that they can either overcome, or in the case of tragedy, they are overcome by the flaws and have a very tragic end.
I agree completely with that. That's what I tried to do with my heroes. A lot of people thought, after talking for several years about paragons of virtue, that I was going to write Superman for nothing but Superman in everybody in my books. But no, my heroes, their foot slipped. That's part of being human, and I think yes, that's in there as well. That is definitely needs to be taken into account to a great degree. But at the same time, I am one of those people who, for right or wrong, I don't know. You might not think I'm right on this, but what I did when I was doing a master's program and I wanted to do a thesis on based on basically um, ancient classic political theory and how it was an outpouring of what you saw before within history and before that mythology. And I steeped myself in the Greeks and read everything that I could get my hands on, either in translation or in the Greek. And the thing is that I would say that there are so many subtle things within Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, that we just don't understand, and we can't analyze them correctly. It's like the idea of the will. You take an idea of the will. We talk about, I want this, I should do this, I will do this. All of these ideas that we just come out in our language. It's an understanding of the Augustinian definition of the will. If you go back to the Greeks and you try to parse their language and try to use the word will, which you do all the time, in the same way, you're just not going to understand it. So again, I agree with you completely when you say that a true hero is foot slips, and that paragons of virtue are people who try to more and more grasp for the perfect, and every time you fail, you have to keep on picking yourself up and grasp again. But at the same time, there's a lot of things in those myths that a lot of people really misinterpret if you don't read it in the Greek. And if you even if you do, whether you're understanding the concepts correctly or you're understanding a transliteration of what is being put down there is a different matter entirely.
You mentioned before that a lot of our language, specifically the language around the will, is presupposed even in modern times where most people have rejected the teachings of Saint Augustine. Um, what how does this idea of the will and of virtue, how why does that matter in the modern age? Because you find that there are a lot of people, even people who are otherwise opposed to the status quo, who reject the idea, these kinds of ancient ideas of virtue as you lay them out. They might have a more Nietzschean understanding of the ancient Greeks, for example. I can think of I can think of a few people who they might call themselves vitalists or and and you also have people who might call themselves classical liberals. I mean, they're two different groups, but what they have in common is they reject this idea of virtue understood in the classical sense and instead embrace some alternative ideas like this kind of Nietzschean vitalism or this kind of positivism, scientism type of understanding of morality. So why is it necessary to bring back these virtues in the modern day?
Well, quite basically, we live in a neo pagan society. I mean, North America, Europe is neo pagan right now. There's no bones about that whatsoever. It's not a Christian society. There are remnants of Christianity, but it's not a Christian society anymore. And the thing is that this was not something that came about all of a sudden. It was a process of hundreds of years of divesting Western civilization of the ideas that come with Christianity. And it is to bring us back to the paganism of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. It really is. That's what they've been doing for the last several hundred years. With the discovery of the Americas and the idea of the noble savage was trying to bring back ideas of Greek Gaia worship. And if you look at Nietzsche, Nietzsche is definitely one of the major steps in doing this because he brings back a Dionysian understanding of things and irrationality and how to analyze things in an irrational way. Although I think he gets the Greeks completely wrong, but he's trying to drive people, and so many thinkers like him, trying to drive people into this neo pagan way of thinking. So it is to bring us backwards in time in the way that people, the normal people, think. And the reason why that has been done and what we see around us today is to really to control people and to make sure that they don't understand the will in the way that medievals understood it, in the way that Augustine put it down. We have a reintroduction into our society, especially right now, especially within the last 10 years, of what I just talked about, of what these Greeks used to think of as these larger controlling forces within the universe that controlled their fate. And so their will was not their own. For the Greeks, it was Moira and Ate, like I said, all these kinds of things that played into it, your doom, your fate, your destiny, all of these kinds of things. What we see around us today, especially within the culture and culture war, you see the exact same thing. They just have different names for them. It's white privilege, or it's whiteness, or it's systemic racism, or it's all of these things that they say, you know what? You can never divest yourself of this. You can never get rid of it. This is your destiny. This is your fate because of, I don't know, the color of your skin, or whether you were born male or female, or all of these things. They're trying to bring you back to that neo pagan idea that the will that you have is not strictly your own, that the decisions you make are not yours, that they are being controlled by these larger forces that you have no say in whatsoever. And the entire reason for that is control.
I suppose it would be easier to control people if you taught them this kind of learned helplessness. I also, while I agree with that, I also think, and tell me if you think that this is correct, that the reason why they put so much emphasis on these larger forces that are beyond people's control is because, well, they want to. sort of excuse their own actions. So because if your will is your own, then you are responsible for the evil that you do. But if these larger forces are to blame for your actions, then you are excused. You can simply say, "Well, I don't really need, I don't really need to fix my life. I can because the thing that broke my life was a force that was larger than myself."
Well, I agree completely with that, but I would take it even one step further than that. It's the idea that you don't have to have any responsibility for your actions whatsoever. And it comes from the idea that you can create yourself or recreate yourself at any moment that you want. So you can define what you are and what supposedly, in the ideas of these quote unquote progressive people, you can redefine at any moment that you are something completely different and completely new than what you were just a moment ago. This is complete irrational thinking. It is the breaking of any kind of rational connection of the past to the present. And the reason for that, one of the reasons, I would say one of the major reasons, is what you just hit on, is the fact that, well, if I can create myself anew, right now, at this moment, from what I did 5 seconds ago, or 10 minutes ago, or yesterday, then I don't have to take any responsibility for those actions at all. They're not my actions. They're actions of a completely different creature than what I am right now. And that gives them the license to do whatever they want, whenever they want, which is just another way of saying being licentious.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of interesting because on the one hand, they want to say that human beings aren't responsible for their actions, and so they're downplaying the power of the will. But on the other hand, they want to say that the will is so strong that it can basically warp reality, uh, like like you can just say something and then boom it happened, boom you are a woman, or boom you are a frog, or something like that. That seems like almost an exaggeration of the power of the will.
It is, but at the same time, you have to understand, I think, anyways, that this entire movement is not a groundswell movement in any way. It is a top-down movement. It is an imposition of ideas from higher learning institutions and things like that. The common man does not come up with these ideas himself, nor does he have them taught by his own experiences. If you want to go back to your experiences and be taught from basic common reality, you're going to come up with rational understanding. So it is a top down movement, and it is a top down movement that does not, as I just talked about in my video this last week, it's not a movement that is going to want to share its control with anyone. And since it doesn't really take into account what a human being really is, what his nature really is, the product of they're trying to control society in various ways, political or cultural. It doesn't work, but they need to obscure that, and they obscure that by again controlling those underneath them. And again, it would all be, in my mind, again, a system of control, because these ideas, they're not natural. They don't come from reality. They don't express themselves through natural law or anything else. So yes, they have to give them exaggerated and contradictory. And you have to understand, again, these are people that are deeply influenced by thinkers like Nietzsche, who contradicted himself all over the place. I studied, because I had to in university, so many classes on Nietzsche, went through almost all of his works because so many people wanted to take Nietzschean classes and they were just all over the place. And I would always come up with the professor and say, okay, he says this here, but he contradicts himself directly by saying the exact opposite here. And the only answer to that question was, he doesn't believe in rationality. He doesn't believe in connection of ideas. He can have one idea one way and the other idea the complete opposite the next. And so these people, they think they're being consistent because they're consistently dealing with their own emotions, which is the only generator of anything consistent in their world. So to them, the will can be something which is completely destroyed so that they have no say over it, while at the same time being something almost godlike that can warp reality.
I think the common denominator there, with the exaggerated view of the will, with this kind of self definition, this almost existentialist view that you find in Sartre, uh, and also this neo pagan uh, uh, exaggeration of forces that control the will. I think the common denominator in both is that these people have a resentment of society. And if one of the things that I notice is, if you have this creation, this kind of self creation myth that you believe in wholeheartedly, then you are going to resent any social order that does not recognize the reality that you created. And this social and likewise, these reinterpretations of fate and Moira in the form of white privilege and patriarchy and things like that, though that is a form of resentment aimed at society. I think a main difference, perhaps, between the modern neo pagans and the ancient pagans is that the ancient pagans probably, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the ancient pagans probably would have told you that you have to accept your fate, whereas these people, they seem to want to say that, the only way you can overcome uh, white privilege or patriarchy by burning everything down. Would you agree?
Well, to some extent, yes, but well, yes, but at the same time, they have, again, it's a system of control. So there are only some people who can do that. There are again, only the people who bend the knee will be accepted in their apologies and their groveling to supposedly have some control over their destiny. It's all a system of control. Again, to those people who are in control of our society, they want to keep their policies going, even though reality shows that they don't work, and they need this support, this irrational support, and they get this irrational support by what basically the selling of indulgences. As people have said it over and over again, that's what this new apology idea is, that you can only, if you apologize, it's still not going to be enough. If you think that you're white and you can get rid of your white privilege, it's not going to be enough. But if you bend the knee to the higher authority of the people who are telling you these ideas, then we'll give you a pass. It's not that you're ever going to get rid of it, but you're always going to be on the bottom rung. But we'll give you a pass. But what you said and talked about as resentment, I think that is completely true. One of the things that I find it's so difficult in dealing with people, because I'm not really a people person. I went to university for a long time, and I just love to argue. And being someone who is really, I would have to say, and many people have told me this, so I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm very good at rhetoric. I know how to argue. I know how to make an argument. But at the same time, when I would try to make an argument from the very fundamental basis of ideas of reality, of common logic and reason that just can't be questioned, you'll see that resentment come straight out at you. When you give people no quarter and say to them, okay, there is no argument that you can make here. There is no way that you can get yourself out of this. Reality is telling you this, and there's absolutely no way that you can maneuver out of it. Resentment is the exact thing that comes out. Anger comes from that resentment, and that's the only thing you're going to get. And again, you see that once again with this whole, well, did you really mean that apology? Or it's the bending of the knee. You see, it's an irrational, it's a skipping out of the rational way of thinking. And they want to do that because if they accept that rational way of thinking, if they understand and acknowledge what reality is, then you have to acknowledge that you have to take responsibility and that you have some duty in life. And a lot of people have been, again, trained from the very time that they were in a cradle, that you don't do that in our current society.
Gotcha. Um, by the way, I will admit that it is a little, there is a little bit of vagueness that I see sometimes in the videos. But when you talk about they don't want you to do this or they want you to bend the knee, who is they? Who is this they in question? Could you describe them?
Well, honestly, I know that on my channel, I try to be as, I don't know, more soft-handed than I usually would be if I was talking to people straight face to face, because I have a lot of people, and from the very beginning of my channel, I know that I have a lot of people that are classical liberals and things like that. But quite honestly, for my own way of thinking, I'm a conservative, obviously, but I'm so conservative that I don't even think I'm on scale anymore. But the point being is that, again, I talked about this in my last video. It's really a Western liberal ideal. And it has been this liberal ideal that has tried to get itself out from the thumb of what logic and reason have pinned down as the truth. Really, I would say the greatest summation of that would be Thomas Aquinas, of course. And yes, since for the last, at the very least, 500 years since the Renaissance, this liberal ideal has been growing to the extent that within the last 200, 300 years, maybe 250, they have gained absolute solid control, so that they're just infighting within themselves rather than even caring about what conservative people think. But it is those people who push these ideas, which are based on liberalism, which is based on a corrupted idea of what liberty is, because they think liberty is do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it, rather than the ability to pursue what is correct and right and true. And it is those people, and they can be on the left, they can be on the right, they can simply be people who believe in what Western liberal democracy has given all of us right now. Many of the people, I'm sure, that are just listening to both of us right now would accept many of the ideals of Western liberal democracy. But if you drill down to the idea of what liberalism is, and to the idea of liberty as doing whatever it is you want, again, it crumbles under the face of reality. And I terms
Hey, you're starting to break up, man.
well,
I'm sorry about that. I mean, it started off well, but it's starting to progressively robot. Is everything okay over there? I know that you live in a very isolated place from your videos, but maybe is everything all right?
yes, yeah. Again, I use satellite internet, and it's a weather thing. Unfortunately, it's the only connection I have way out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it started roboting when you were talking about when you drill down into liberalism and this idea of liberty being whatever, doing whatever you want, that kind of area.
So, well, basically, I just wanted to say that again, it's not a directed. These are the people who you got to watch out for. It's more of the living of this idea that liberty is do whatever you want, and anybody who champions that idea is someone who is contrary to reality, if you ask me. And that's the kind of person I would oppose myself to. But more, I don't oppose myself to people as much as oppose myself to ideas.
Gotcha, gotcha. Um, I think that you do a good job, though, of pointing out that it was essentially these higher education institutions who are coming up with these kinds of ideas, and they're and as they pursue this kind of liberal idea of freedom, they are progressively detaching themselves, decoupling themselves from reality. Now, I've we can get more into the weeds of that, but I'd like to slightly pivot the topic and go into the idea of comic books and the culture war that surrounds them. Um, as anyone who knows about these kinds of comic books knows that they really came into their own in the kind of interwar period and really started to become a cultural force within the last few decades with the rise of the MCU and the Avengers and all and movies and all these other cinema phenomenon. Uh, so it seems as though this idea of comic book superheroes seems to be very much intertwined with liberalism. Would you not agree?
I would agree, but at the same time, a lot of the people who came back from World War II and wrote comics that we know of most of the time had really to go through the school of hard knocks with going through the war. And so I do see strains of traditional heroism there, even though a lot of them have liberal leanings, to say the least.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. The idea that reality is one of their teachers, and so they learned heroism from that experience rather than from any kind of formal education.
That's definitely, if you look at, I would say probably the biggest influence on the creation of modern comic books and the ideas and stories that you see around you today, being Jack Kirby. That is exactly what happened to him.
Mm. I also read in places that a lot of these people did not have like what we would call literature degrees back then. A lot of these people were just going into these businesses to make money telling stories, and they were following in this kind of pulp fiction direct tradition. Did I lose you, RJ? Oh no, did I lose connection? Um, oh no. Well, I wanted to. Let's see. Did it? Gosh, this is embarrassing. Um, okay, so while I'm waiting for RJ, uh, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the maybe sing some praises of RJ's channel. Uh, a lot of the things that RJ talks about on his channel, the emphasis on virtue ethics and stuff. In large part, it was an inspiration for my channel, though I took it in a very different direction, where he focuses on, you know, virtue ethics as seen in uh, pop culture and the idea of a hero being a paragon of virtue and why virtue matters in a story. I mainly take a broader approach and just comment about applying virtue ethics to everyday situations and especially politics. So you might have a kind of virtue ethics analysis of, say, resentment, and for example, and how it opposes the virtue of humility. It's it's quite an interest, but I would recommend checking out RJ's channel and his work. It is very much well argued for. RJ, are you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry about
Okay.
this. Again, I have to apologize to people all the time about my satellite internet. It is affected by the weather, but it's the only thing I got.
Oh, that's fine. It's fine. I was just talking to the audience a little bit about your channel and how you put a lot of thought into, you lay out all of these arguments one after other about how the idea of the hero as a paragon of virtue is very much necessary to any story that claims to be a story about heroes, even modern day superhero stories. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's more consent. concentrated around the idea of story itself. I usually go back to the logical and rational way of defining a story, which came from Aristotle, because Aristotle did his Poetics, and he has several lost works on this idea. But he talks about heroes and how your story has to have a hero and why it has to have a hero, because it's a representation of reality, and people don't want to see bad people actually get good things. It just is a revolting idea. It is something that people don't like. But the point is that I think that Greek storytelling, since it was so rational and tied to reality, just trumped all of the other kinds of storytelling that it hit up against with your Norse and your Celtic and everything else in Europe. And so that's the kind of storytelling we're used to. And if you want to really understand what storytelling is, you got to go back to Aristotle. And he was dealing with, again, Homer and Hesiod, and stories that were 1,200 years in the BC, so 800 years before him. So it's very much an old idea of story, and hero is connected to it because it's, again, part of human reality connected to the reality that we see around us.
Gotcha. You do put a lot of emphasis on how these older traditions have won out, and today nobody really questions them outright. They're sort of assumed, and if this idea of hero is challenged, it's usually challenged for very superficial reasons. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Again, I don't think a lot of people really understand the basis of these ideas, because they did have a high point of intellectual high point within the Middle Ages, and it's extremely complex. Sometimes you go back to Aristotle, and some of his works are very dense, but at the same time, we do have a continued a cultural norm of his ideas throughout our society.
Hmm. What would you say is an example of this classic idea of a hero being being expressing itself in modern day superhero comics?
Oh, that's hard to pin down. Quite honestly, I would have to go back to the older Superman, because if you listen to Jim Shooter talk, he started writing Superman when he was what, like 14, 15 years old. And he said he wrote Superman for a number of years as Sir Galahad. And he said, if you can't write Superman as Sir Galahad, then you get a new writer. And he went on to take over Marvel Comics and make it into what it is today. So his idea of what Superman was, the idea that many people come up with, the big blue Boy Scout, that is very much, again, going back to Arthurian myth, and that ties into traditional ideas of heroism, which goes back to taking Celtic myth and putting it into a rational Greek way of storytelling.
That is very interesting how that sort of cross pollination takes place. Uh, I There is also this idea in in the kinds of superhero stories of, like, the villain being a darker reflection of the hero, the villain having either the vices that the hero's virtue is opposed to, or or the villain be having an exaggeration of the hero's own vices. And while the hero overcomes their vices, the villain sort of succumbs to these vices and go dives deeper into depravity. Or else maybe he might find redemption one day, as some villains in comics do from time to time.
There
I
are many different ways that you can express a villain, and that's one of the ways. But again, I think there are several ways. I try to go over many of them on my channel because I talk about storytelling a lot. But you hit on one that's really something a lot of people understand innately, but don't really understand the mechanics of. I think it's the fact that if you have virtue and you are a paragon of virtue, those virtues need to be ordered by temperance. And if you don't have that order of temperance within your life, those virtues can become vices very simply. You can very easily see justice turn into vengeance. You can very easily see courage turn into foolhardy action, all these kinds of things. So there are many ways to take that heroic ideal and twist it just very small ways so that they become villainous. But yes, it is a very good idea to, if you're studying ideas of heroism, to pattern your villain after the antithesis of obviously your hero.
Right, right. Because in Aristotle's his scheme of virtue ethics, you have a you have a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess, and the vice of deficiency is too little of a trait, and a vice of excess is too much of that given trait. So courage, like you say, the of deficiency opposed to courage is cowardice, and while the vice of excess is foolhardiness. Um, the Now, one of the things that I find within a lot of modern stories is this idea of the anti-hero. How would you say that idea of the anti-hero fits in with this kind of virtue scheme? Why do people do you think that there's something wrong with the idea of the anti-hero? And does it say something bad about our culture that anti-heroes are seen as more appealing?
Well, I think there is something wrong with the idea of an anti-hero, but I think it was a conversation, especially within our literature, that needed to be had. Just because of the fact that, again, I always go back to the idea of an anti-hero as being someone who does heroic things, even though he doesn't mean to do them. So it's all dependent upon concepts of the will, whether or not he's freely exercising his will to do these things. I would say an anti-hero is defined by they're doing something heroic, even though they're not willing it. And that is a idea that I think really blossomed in the 90s, because you had, first of all, these ideas which we're talking about right now, these larger ideas in their infancy being brought into the culture, and you had a lot of people saying to themselves and questioning, with all of this stuff going on and the control in their lives, whether or not they had a free will that was what Western civilization had told them what it was, whether they could live that way or not. So the idea of an anti-hero is an exploration, I think, of that idea, and the idea of will, whether or not you can still be heroic without it being your will, all of this kind of things. That's why I think that idea of anti-hero really blossomed within in the 1990s.
Wow, I actually have never heard it said that described like that. Anti-hero being someone who does heroic things without willing heroism. So it's because normally most people would say that an anti-hero is a hero that fails, that somehow has failed to live virtuously. Like maybe like they might say, look at a someone who desires desires to do justice, but goes about it in an extremely brutal way as a kind of an anti-hero. It seems, and they might say, well, that person seems to want to do good and means well, but he's the way he's going about doing it is perhaps in a kind of evil, brutal way, and that's usually how they would describe an anti-hero.
Well, I think that we're you
Oh, you're roboting again. You're roboting again. Hmm. Well, it says, uh, yeah. So that's. I mean, it just it seems to me that the idea of the anti-hero has two sides to it. There are people ha- uh, who do good things, but they don't intend to do so. But there's also people who intend to do good things, but don't engage in heroic actions. This kind of extremist character. Uh,
Well, again, that's what I would say. I think we're talking about the same thing because I would say the core of an actual hero is the willing of the good. That needs to be there, and so yes, you have these characters which are not willing the good, but at the same time producing a good result. So honestly, what you're describing, I think, is what I am describing is just I am trying to go back to more primary motivations.
oh, I see, I see. I just, it's I'm just kind of confused because um, on the one hand, if you have a character who wills the good, but he does what might traditionally be called evil actions in pursuing the good, a lot of people would call that anti-heroic in a way. What would you say to those
Yes,
kinds of
but
people?
well, again, I would say that it all comes down to the will. I'm with St. Augustine on this. It all comes down to the will. I think that we are living in an age where that idea is confused, that a lot of people think that they're controlled by something that is other than their will. But to me, it's all personal choice. It comes down to your will. What do you choose to do? As Augustine would say, the character of the human will is of moment. It depends on what you do in this moment. That's why you try to be a virtuous, which is tied to habit. So how many moments can you do the same thing? So again, virtues would be habits. It is the habit of constantly doing the same thing, doing it correctly, doing it according to your end in life, which is to say your human nature. And if that's not there, then that habit is not there, then you're not being virtuous, then you're not a hero. I know I think of things in really black and white terms, but if you break it down to its component parts, uh, that's the way that I would define it.
Oh no, I can respect a more black and white view. For me, I always keep in mind. I believe it was Solzhenitsyn who said that the who to paraphrase him, good and evil divide every human heart." So the black and white, we have to we have to remember that although the world is divided into black and white, good and evil, um, the good and evil are inside of us. They're not. It's not like you can externalize them so that there's one side who is wholly good and one side that is wholly evil. At least in this material existence.
That comes down to ideas of good and evil, which I do talk about on my channel every once in a while. Again, I go back to, well, I guess I'm not even entirely sure if you could call it Augustinian or Thomistic or whatever, but it's more of a medieval mindset of the fact that good is a thing. It is a thing that exists in itself. It is objective, whereas evil is a state. It's not an objective thing. It's a turning away from what is. It's a turning away from what is good. And that turning away or turning towards is an act of the will, and that's where heroics comes from. And sometimes you can be turned in the right direction by some things in your life that just come together as a culmination of your own choices and reality, and not know it. And I think that's where the idea of an anti-hero comes in. And I think, again, it's a good, it was at the very least a good conversation to have concerning our society, whether or not one can be heroic without being virtuous.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you see that's wrong in modern day comics? Uh, keeping in mind that keeping in mind this idea of the hero and virtue, what would you say in summary is wrong with modern day comics and how they portray heroes?
Oh, modern day comics are not even stories anymore. That's a big can of worms, but I'll try to answer it as best I can. But they're not even stories anymore. I've gone over this on my channel so many times. You're being presented with things that look like characters. They're not characters. They're ideas. They're ideas in a mask. I've gone over, the people in control of Marvel Comics saying exact that exact thing, that these characters need to be pushing ideas. They would say pushing positive ideas, but by positive they mean, of course, the progressive, quote unquote, progressive ideal, the woke ideal that we see around us
Mm.
today. That's what they want them to push as ideas. They're not even. It is straight up propaganda. It's not storytelling. It's That's why it's so hard to answer that question, because what you see in comics today, it's not storytelling. It's propaganda. It's trying to teach people things in a way that gets around their rational mind by habituating them to.
Right. Yeah, yeah, the so the kind of virtue ethics that you see within in older stories that's just completely lost on these modern day authors because and they've completely replaced this idea of virtue with the idea of, like you said before, uh, bending the knee to an ideology. And as such, the heroes that you see, they're not really heroes. They're not paragons of virtue. They are only heroes to these people in the sense that they embody different aspects of this ideology that they have crafted. A sort of, and if they happen to do heroic things, it's not because they intend to do the good in the classical sense, but only in kind of anti-hero sense, where they intend to they're just they're just puppets for a propaganda piece that happen to do good things within whatever, I guess you can't really call it kind of a pseudo story that they're in. Would you say that's correct? Oh, well now, RJ cut out. Man, I must have gotten him at a wrong time. Because it seems like he has a storm going on at his house, and that's probably really interfering with what he's doing. Um, so sorry about this, folks. It's but I really do appreciate RJ coming on. Um, let's see. Pulsating Shadow says, what Landian virtue ethics would be like. Landian virtue ethics, as in Nick Land. I mean, considering he's a postmodernist, I don't think he has an idea of virtue ethics. I think his his idea of ethics would be a lot closer to these progressive people that we're talking about. You know, the this kind of paradoxical view that the will the will has this godlike power to recreate reality while at the same time being subject to forces that are higher than itself that we just can't control, that we just have no say in. I mean, that's at work whenever he talk. It's just that in Nick Land's case, instead of it being white privilege and patriarchy that are in control of our lives, it's artificial intelligence and capitalism. You know, if you've ever read Nick Land, he talks about how capitalism is essentially, he describes capitalism as a mind controlling AI sent from the future to the past in order to influence us. And to make and that this kinds of efficiency machine, it's just automated at this point and we can't stop it. You know, its takeover of humanity is inevitable. All right. Hey,
I have to apologize once again. I don't know what it is about the weather today. Usually I have much better connection.
maybe it's just maybe it's just our doom. That's hey, it's a little joke. Anyway, yeah, I was just entertaining the audience by talking. You know, the commenter mentioned a figure named Nick Land, who is like a quote unquote right wing postmodernist, where and I just was telling them Nick Land probably doesn't have an idea of virtue ethics because he has this idea of these larger forces controlling our will. Only in Nick Land's case, it's artificial intelligence and capitalism controlling our will rather than white privilege and patriarchy.
Yes, well, I again, postmodernism is one of those things I had to study a lot in university, and I don't think, again, the whole point of postmodernism is that it rejects the ideas not only of the ancients and the medievals, but also even the interpretation of those ideas in a modern way.
Mm. So one of our commenters says they wanted us to perhaps focus on like a concrete case study character examples as opposed to speaking in general terms. I suppose he's talking. I mean, we already talked about the example of Superman as a paragon of virtue, um, being someone that was explicitly based off of Galahad. Um, but perhaps taking an example from modern day comics, the kind of these pseudo characters. Um, Perhaps we could look at, say, could you give perhaps an example of one that's at the top of your mind as an
At
example
the
of a
top of my
character?
mind would probably be if you want to go for a new character because they've redefined old characters all the time to try to make them into this ideal. But the one that they've created that is pretty much the really the center of this idea is the new Miss Marvel, which would be Kamala Khan. She was created quite literally to flout the ideas of Aristotelian storytelling. That is to say, she was supposed to be a hero without a pathos. They come out quite literally and said they wanted to create these heroes, and especially this hero, quote unquote hero, without a pathos. At the same time, she was an embodiment of ideas. The ideas they basically took the vice president of the company, who was person in control of the company, who would be Sana Amanat, and said, "We're going to write this book for all the little girls who are like you, to take all of your experiences and just pour them into this character." And we're talking about experiences like again, talking about these bigger forces, because she's a woman, because she's a person of color, because she's the daughter of immigrants. They came from Pakistan, and all these kinds of things. She's not Christian. All these ideas, they just poured these ideas into what you would see as being a character, but it isn't really. And even though at the very first of the creation of that character, it might have had some ideas that were in the older vein of telling a story, but as it grew and more, this character is an embodiment simply of ideas like that. It is to, again, they talk about how it's about all about feeling. It's all about empathy and sympathy. It's got nothing to do with heroism. It's got nothing to do with conflict. They want to take conflict completely out of these stories. Same thing with the new Superman. The writer for that, I think, was Tom Taylor, saying that he wanted to write an entire series where this character is Superman, and yet he is not going to act. He is not going to have to fight. Is not going to have to do any of these things. Again, so there are plenty of characters, but that would be the one that really comes to my mind at the forefront. Would be the new Miss Marvel.
Certainly, that's a good example. I can certainly see why you'd choose something like that. I think another one that comes to my mind is uh, the new Spider-Man, Miles Morales. I know that there was this guy named Ripa who talks a lot about the creation, what went into the creation of Miles Morales, and essentially these people said they wanted a mixed race Spider-Man to reflect our the then president Barack Obama, and they wanted to make this character to appeal to modern audiences. They wanted to have this kind of representation, and this character wasn't really a hero, a character in himself. In fact, Ripa talks about how a lot of what this character is just copy paste of the ultimate universe version of Peter Parker, complete to redrawing panels that are very similar in a way that sort of reflects Peter Parker. He's essentially just like a copy paste of the original Spider-Man, but he's mixed race. And why? Because they wanted to check a box of representation. You know, oh, we have the mixed race Spider-Man there, and now years later, they're coming up with all kinds of Spider-Men and women and other and alpha spider alphabet people who have this kind of who are checking every box of representation. You know, we it's not do these characters quote unquote actually have well character? That's sort of on the side.
Well, to talk about that character for a second, it's a different way of looking at it, sort of. But yeah, exactly. You're exactly right with what you're saying. I just did again a video about postmodernism there a couple of weeks ago, talking about how a postmodern sees a story and how you have there's a major professor in Japan who wrote about this in the early 2000s, talking about how these postmodern thinkers that are audiences, postmodern audience doesn't care about a story. All they want to do is they're a database of tropes. They have these tropes in their mind, and as long as those tropes are hit one after another, they think that's a story. Well, but it's not a story. It's just a connection of these things. And this is what you get with Miles Morales. You take all of those tropes from the original Spider-Man and you just throw them down in a different order upon the page. And it's a different order because he doesn't have the same color skin. And so that's supposed to be a story, but everyone who knows what a story is, who understands in a non-postmodern way, would say, no, that's not a story, but that's all that character is. And again, what we were talking about before, about it being not really a character in itself and has no substance to it. What they've been doing with Miles Morales over the last year or so was to make him every other superhero, was to make a Miles Morales Thor, was to make a Miles Morales, I don't know, I didn't follow them all, but they just basically swapped him with every other character and made all the other Marvel characters into Miles Morales. So again, that's not a character. That's just an idea that's been embodied. That's all that really is.
Right, and that's really what it comes down to, right? It's these new characters are actually sort of pseudo characters. And the stories that they take part in are pseudo stories because they don't have the proper form that we would classically understand as a story and as a character. And you'd probably push back against people who said, "Oh well, you know, why should we care about your definition of a story?" With, let me guess, the this isn't my definition. This is the traditional way of doing things that most people have been uh, assuming is the correct way for thousands of years. Would that be correct?
Yes, but I would push back on that by saying that the reason why we have this story kind of storytelling and the reason why I'm talking about it and why it's been around in Western civilization for thousands of years now, I would say going on to at least 3,000 years now, is because it's so tied to reality, both reality outside us and the human reality. And if you're trying to tell stories on other kinds of reality, which again, you can go back to Celtic myth and try to read some of that from its pure sources, or Norse myth, where they don't have this kind of structure, you will be hard pressed to understand what is going on if you read original sources. All of a sudden, you're following somebody, and the entire thing jumps to something else, and some guy turns into a salmon, and then the story's over. It makes zero sense because you're not in that time and place. So the whole point of story really is the connection to its rational understanding of reality. And a rejection of that kind of storytelling is a rejection of rationality and a rejection of reality.
Mm. It makes me, yeah, it makes a lot more sense then to describe these modern thinkers as a kind of neo-pagan because Uh, it's not just in the way they perceive the will; it's also in the way they tell their stories, their new modern mythologies. That it has striking similarities because the tropes are lining up one after the other, just like how in Norse myth you have a guy turning into a salmon coming after something that didn't make sense before.
It's definitely a new mythology. That is one of the statements that, again, this woman that I've been talking about, Sana Amanat, who has left Marvel Comics now, but for more than 10 years was in operational control of Marvel Comics, the vice president of content and character development. She literally said that Marvel Comics and their stories and all what Marvel produces is a new mythology, and that new mythology was to be used in a psychological way to push these ideas, which are progressive ideas. She literally came out and said that.
Right. So so you could say then that this culture war and the relevance of these kinds of bad, low quality um, schlock, that's this propaganda that's taking the place of our entertainment. Uh, it's not simply people are pointing at it and going and blaming all kinds of things. But I think you seem to have your thumb on the issue to mix my idioms. You seem to have your thumb on the pulse. I think that's the expression when you say that it all goes back to them purposefully deviating from the idea of a traditional hero, and and to the extent that they deviate from this, it's going to create problems with their storytelling.
Yeah, definitely. I did a couple of videos about 2 years ago now about it was a Marvel podcast put out by Marvel on their website, talking to a bunch of Marvel writers who were the new writers for Marvel. They were doing the podcast saying these were the new great writers for Marvel, and all of these writers talked about how they didn't like to write heroes, how they preferred villains, how they preferred to explore villains, and because villainy in that sense was more free than being a hero. A hero put you in a box. You have to act in certain ways. They didn't want to write heroes. They wanted to write villains, and they explore those villainous ideas. And again, these are what they're presenting, what Marvel itself is presenting as these are the new great writers that are going to be telling you stories for years to come.
I mean, I think I've heard that from I heard about that from you and another guy, Literature Devil. But I mean, I think people underestimate just how much of this is perpetuated by actual malice and not simply incompetence, or how the incompetence flows from this lack of virtue found within the authors of this material. Uh, I think people tend to believe that, oh, you shouldn't attribute to malice what could be attributed to incompetence, but you seem to be saying that the incompetent story writing is directly linked to their lack of virtue, their evil, and their fascination with evil and villainy. Because
Definitely.
yeah, and you also mentioned the word freeing, that they were enticed by the fact that villains are more free than heroes. Would you say that this has a lot to do with the ideology of liberalism?
Oh, definitely. And like I said, you have these people. They. There's one. I did a video about this woman who is Marika Tamaki. She's a fairly prominent writer right now. She's written She-Hulk and Batman and a number of other major figures in the comic world. And she went on to talk about in this interview, not with me, but with I think it was like the CBC in Canada. She was talking to them about how human beings, in her way of thinking, are absolutely nothing. They're just mimicry of things that you see around you all of your life. You're just basically a memory bank of what you see around you, and you're an ape. you mimic those things which you have seen, you take them out and mimic them every once in a while. That's her idea of what a human being is. And she says you're nothing else than that. And that's how she writes characters, obviously, because that's what she thinks actual human beings are like. And on the topic of the deliberate actions of these people, again, there was just this about 6 months ago, not even, maybe 4 months ago, the leaked Zoom call for Disney Studios. We had all these people, heads of Disney Studios, talking about their not so subtle queer agenda, how they're going to push it in so much, even more and more. I just did a video about a Zoom call that was from the Writers Guild of America, where you had comic book writers and show writers and television producers all talking about how do we take traditionally heterosexual characters and turn them queer, even if they've been heterosexual for 80 years. How do we do that? That was literally the 2-hour Zoom call that they had with about 7 or 8 people who run the gamut, from people who are running the shows to people who are writing the shows and writing the original source material. This is what they're talking about. And they're talking about how you had to do it subtly, how you had to do it slowly, how you had to enter it in a way that is political, and how it was something that was to crack into the minds of people. I did another video about a book con where this woman was talking about inserting progressive ideas into children's picture books. Again, it was a panel of several people. She said, she quoted some older author, which they all agreed about, that you had to be as if you were under the bedclothes with that child reading the book with the flashlight, whispering these progressive ideas into their ear. So this is not subtle. This is not by chance. This is them deliberately trying to do this, and it's deliberately trying to do this because they're the ones in control now. And they freely admit that we control things now. This is what we're going to do.
Oh yeah, it's and about the going back earlier to the person who is all about who says that humans are nothing but mimickers. It's actually very similar to what I talk about on my channel, which is the power of mimesis, and how virtue ethics actually is something meant to curb mimesis. And you find this in this idea when there's a great author by the name of uh, Rene Girard, who he's the guy who came up with the idea of the scapegoat, uh, uh, and he got these, and he, from his reading of classical literature and the Bible, he came up with the idea. He had this idea of mimesis, that human beings were naturally mimicking animals, and that the reason why one of the reasons why rules and laws that limit people's desires exist is because there is this necessity to limit that desire to mimic others, and this desire to have what your neighbor has, because if you do not limit this, it will tear your societies apart. And what they do to limit this is actually very clever. It turns you essentially have these role models placed before people, these paragons of virtue, what you might call heroes. Um, they're placed before people, and the people then mimic those virtues, and and you have institutions that teach these virtues, and it's done so in a way that instills temperance into the people. It prevents them from just coveting coveting everything their neighbor has, and fighting over each other over what the other people have, because that's really what happens when you let mimesis go wild, run wild. Is you essentially have a situation where everyone tears each other apart out of envy and greed.
I'm not familiar with the author that you're talking about, but to me, that just harkens back to it once again, as most things do for me, to Aristotelian ideas about the fact that what that what you've just described really is the process of growing up that Aristotle would say. And yeah, sure, you do that when you're a child. You do that when you don't have a fully formed reason. As Augustine would say, you do that when your will is not completely your own. But once you get to be a rational person who can make rational decisions, you have a fully formed reason, and your will is your own, then someone you should step out of that and become the author of your own actions at that point. Not to say that that kind of thing doesn't have merit. Certainly, when you're growing up, that for Aristotle, you would say that you can't be a really good virtuous person unless you go through that process of mimicking these heroic ideals that are placed in front of you. But that would be a childish idea, a growing up idea that has to be stepped out of at some point.
Well, yeah, I think it's no accident that Rene Girard, when he's arguing for the fact that humans have this mimesis, he points to the example of children getting into an argument over like a ball that the other child has. It's it is a very childish mindset, and it kind of and I think it points to the idea that part of growing up is this idea of virtue. And when you rebel against this idea of virtue, you are in essence rebelling against maturity almost.
Oh, I would agree with that. And that's why in our society where people are taught to be perpetual children, no one can get out of that stage. And literally, I myself, even though I went through university for a long time with several degrees, I didn't get to that stage until almost. I didn't even start to get to that stage until I was almost done of all of that university. I talked about on some of my channel or some of my videos about this, what I basically saw as a quest for understanding after that point, where I try to say to myself, okay, what is virtue? As Marcus Aurelius would say, what is the thing within itself? And I tried to seek that out, and I found that it took me almost 20 years, almost, and it wasn't so much the seeking out of something that wasn't there, because that's what I thought it was at first, but it was a divesting myself of all of these false ideas that have been implanted in me that were non-reality based ideas, and really accepting what virtue is, and accepting what I was as a human being, and taking responsibility for it, which again is just a big old long way of saying I grew up. It took me a long time, even though I maybe because I was in university for so long. I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, the universities are where a lot of these ideas are cooked up. So maybe being in university for so long had that kind of corrupting effect on you.
Quite possibly.
Um, so, if I may, I'd like to ask a little bit about the work that you're doing personally, like the writing that you've been doing. Um, how does like for example, the Thomas Valiant books and the Valiant Heroes, and what was the last one? That fantasy series, Honin
Crom the Destroyer is very
Crom
much
the
a sort
Destroyer.
of old old sorcery, sword and sorcery kind of idea, going back way into prehistory kind of sword and sorcery.
Hmm. So, what would you say is how would you say that these stories embody the ideas of heroism that you preach on your channel? Could you walk like how did you come up with how did you craft these stories? Is it sort of like, did you consciously implement the ideas of virtue and heroism in your stories as you were writing them, or did it just kind of come naturally to you as you were writing
Uh,
it?
Yes and no, I'd say there are a lot of hints, especially in Thomas Valiant, really, because it's one continuous story. It's 82 pages, but it's in three chapters in one continuous story. The other book, The Valiant Heroes, is three different stories, the size of a normal comic. Crom is 64 pages, which is a continuous story. But within Thomas Valiant, again, I try to introduce ideas in the background, not really in the foreground. It's all about the actions of the people, but um, for example, there's one part in the story where the main hero, which is Thomas Valiant, is doing something heroic, and he had to be running up a street while he was doing this. So I said, okay, I'll make that. Make that street Prudential Street because it's he's doing something prudent, right? It wasn't that I was smacking you over the head with these ideas within the story itself. I use them as accents to the story itself. But again, what I do stories in a bit of an odd way in that I take a story that, or one or more stories that I really like that have usually gone off the rails at some point, and I try to rewrite the ending for that story so that it seems more real to me that this would be the ending to the story. And then usually after I get to that point, I go back and write the beginning because it needs to more condense and flow with my ending, which then gives me an entirely new story. But I always work within a framework, is basically what I'm trying to say. I work within that framework. I'm given a framework either by my imagination, sometimes by a dream, sometimes by other stories. And I work within that framework according to the ideas of reality and what would happen next. One of the things, again, I was talking about my master's and the ideas I was trying to express there. It started out with the idea that the Greeks were trying to take inspiration, that idea of inspiration, and transfer it from mythology to stories that weren't quite myth to history and then into philosophy and all these kinds of things. And their idea of really, I would say that inspiration is looking at reality and trying to understand the rules and how everybody would act according to rules. And I think that's what Homer's work is, especially the Iliad. It's that, okay, you got all these kings together. We know the basic bones of the story, where it happened, the basic events. You have all of these people together. Then what would happen first, according to how people act with each other and how our culture would say that these people should act. So this king speaks first. He says that first. So it's all a method of calculation in my mind to try to tell as real a story as possible with a bare bones of understanding from some place or other where I get them from, the skeleton of what I am writing.
Mm. I like how you so so you would say that in a good story, this idea of virtue ethics, it's not something that would be hit you over the head like the kind of messaging you would find within modern day propaganda. It's something that acts as a sort of thing that it's sort of a background assumption. All the characters are essentially, the world itself, and how people act, sort of assumes this virtue ethics, this kind of virtue ethics idea, and that is that is to say, and I think you and I would agree that that is essentially reality.
I would agree, but I would also say that this is the traditional way which you used to be taught of how to write a story. I've written, at the very least, one full manuscript for a novel, and working with professional editors, that's the exact thing that they would pound home over and over and over again in my head. They would say, okay, you have to rewrite this because this person would not act in this way or say this thing according to how they have acted previously to this, or according to how human beings act. This is the exact thing that they would do. They say, this is not real. Rewrite this section, rewrite this sentence, rewrite this character. And so that's really traditional storytelling. And it's not me coming up with it. If I was working with older editors, this is the way storytelling has evolved to the right into the editor. So, I'm just trying to bring out old forms of good storytelling.
Mm, I see. I see. I think that really clarifies things for a lot of people because People have this idea of realism in their head, but they don't. I don't think a lot of them seem to understand that that a lot goes into that. The idea of the hero, the idea of virtue ethics, the idea that stories are a reflection of reality. I don't think they think about it unconsciously. They just, but I do think that a lot of people, when they look at a movie character and they just don't, and the actions of the characters, they don't seem to reflect real how real people would act, and it creates this kind of dissonance in their mind, and they think, well, wait a second, that's not right. You know what I mean?
No, I know exactly what you mean. I think that modern cinema and everything else is trying to cover up their tracks of that disconnection with spectacle. That's really about it. So that they hit these tropes and it looks like a story, and they keep you mesmerized with the spectacle, so that you don't see that it's not really a story.
Mm. So, what would you say to someone who wants to start writing fiction or original fiction, like say a comic book or a novel or even a short story, um, and they want to start and they want to do this in the way that depicts real heroes? What would you say to that person? What kind of advice would you give?
That's a hard one. I would
Hmm.
say that as a writer to begin with, again, my writing of that manuscript for the novel was really the school of hard knocks for me, because previous to that, I've written short stories and things to try to get them published in magazines and all that kinds of things. But it wasn't until I really worked with an editor that I saw what needed to be done. And the thing was that with that book, I had the very, um, I guess you'd say, fortuitous thing that I did was I based all the characters on people I knew, on myself or others that I knew very very well, and you can't break reality when you know what reality is. If you're trying to put that kind of thing down on a page, you're trying to take people that you know and turn them into fictional characters in a world that's not quite your own. That gives you such a grounding that it keeps you honest. So that's for writing itself. For me, I would say start there. If you really don't think that your writing is up to snuff, try doing something like that. But to write a hero, a traditional hero, quite honestly, it's the thing that you had just talked about. It's the fact that again, some of us are just big children. Some of us haven't grown up, in some ways big, in some ways small. But look at traditional heroes, absorb those ideas of traditional heroes. Read King Arthur myths, read any of these old stories that feature heroes, and try to find that place where something, I guess, the Odyssean way of putting it was where the thumos will rise in your chest, where you feel something within you that this is heroic. Grasp onto that and see if you can find the common denominator between those kinds of heroes that you love to read. I think that that will give you a good direction at the very least. If you don't want to go and study all the things that I'm talking about, that will give you a good direction by looking at these older stories and finding those things which inspire you.
Definitely. We could always use a few more inspiring heroes in stories because, a lot of these stories seem almost designed to either lull us into this kind of dreamlike daze, or even demoralize us. But the the best kinds of stories, the kinds that that are good to read, are ones that help inspire us to be better than ourselves. And and that's really why I love reading those older works. And I'm hoping to get my hands on the Thomas Valiant stuff, because it looks like my cup of tea. Sorry about the dogs in the background.
No, I think you're right on the money. And one of the things that always says to me that I hit something that really means it is I'm one of these people who goes around because I'm a story junkie. I've been so for almost all of my life as far as I can remember back. But I go around quoting lines from movies and from books and things like that. And if they stick that much in my head, there's something there. You got to look at what is there that makes that stick in your mind. I pull out quotes from Julius Caesar or from Hamlet, or all the way down to It's a Wonderful Life or A Bridge Too Far or things like that all the time. And so find those great stories, find well told stories, and really immerse yourself in them.
All right. Well, I this has been a very interesting conversation. Although the fact that we had some technical difficulties here and there didn't make it ideal, I did enjoy this conversation. I think it was very insightful. Um, what do you have going on? What do you have planned for the future of your channel? What is your next video idea?
Oh, I don't know. Honestly, my video ideas, people keep thinking that I should publish my videos as in write them or just publish them as if I have them all written down. I don't. I just think them up. I mean, it's train of thought. I just sit down and give you my train of thought. Usually that takes somewhere between 25 and 45 minutes. Sometimes it doesn't hit me until I'm about to sit down. So, um, I would like, honestly, to continue with the videos that I have that explore philosophical ideas through pop culture. But at the same time, I realize that if I want to have a real good shot at trying to sell my stories, that I do need to go more in that direction of storytelling and give the audience what they want in that direction as well. But that's all that I have for where it's going to go in the future.
I definitely like the idea of your channel. Promoting other independent comic book artists that are going against the grain of Marvel and DC. I think that is certainly a positive change to your channel. It's certainly the direction my channel has been it's mostly what I've been doing a lot, which is trying to promote other people who are, I think, smarter and wiser than myself, who have created some pretty good work and that you should check out. Hello?
Oh yeah, I'm still here. Sorry.
Oh, it's fine. I it's a little there was a little bit of an awkward silence there. I must have I was just did you hear what I was saying earlier?
Yes, well, one of the things I tried to do with the first of my channel was to promote other comic creators and other creators, and I just kicked a hornet's nest when I did that. I remember, oh my, I just tried to promote some people that were on the other side because I thought they were telling good stories, and wow, that did not turn out well. So I think I've finally gotten to the point where I can sift through who wants to be on my channel and who doesn't, who wants to be connected with me and who doesn't. So I might get back to the roots of trying to help people out in that way, because it's building culture and that's what we need to do.
Oh wow, I had no idea. But yeah, I've run into that problem before where you invite someone on because you like their content, but then it turns out that they're not exactly as nice as you thought they were. Like they might turn on you, or yeah, that's never fun. I can understand why you might have been discouraged by that. Um, but certainly I do think that it is a positive thing because there are a lot of people who just complain about uh, who complain about the way modern society is, and then they go in and say, well, why don't people who are more conservative have more artists on their side? And meanwhile, you have all these right-leaning artists who there seems to be some kind of disconnect between them and the kind of commentators and complainers, as if as if the actual right wing content creators are invisible or they're just not worthy of attention.
Yeah, well, there's one of the things I found with YouTube, unfortunately, is that, and I try my best to avoid it as much as possible, is the fact that just controversy sells and being negative sells, and it promotes your video, and they will promote your video, and it will do so much better if you're negative. But you gotta kick against that goad. You have to make sure that you balance it out with the positive. Although many people call me black pilled, to say the least, I always say that the reason why I focus on the negative so much is because I want to get rid of it and focus on the positive. I want everybody to shine that light on the things that don't work and see them for what they are, and so that we can build.
Black build. I've never really gotten that from your channel. Because I think a lot of the black pilled channels, in my experience, tend to focus on have this message of doom that you can't. There's nothing that can be done, and your channel doesn't seem to do that.
No, but some people when certainly when they come in just off the cuff and aren't familiar with my material, that's where they think I'm going with it. But because I talk about heroes so much, and it's so much ingrained now in all that I talk about, um, that sometimes it doesn't come out as clearly as I intend it to be. Because really, it was the center of why I created the channel, and partly why I wanted to create it in that way, which was to give that lifeline of hope. Because you can be heroic yourself, and there are true heroes out there, and they're on the page and they're on the street, and you can be one of them. And really, that's something that needs to be shouted from the housetops right now, because a lot of people are trying to kill that idea.
Definitely something. I definitely think that it's heroic to want to preserve that idea of heroism. Well, everyone, I I certainly enjoyed this conversation, and please check out RJ's channel and his written content. RJ, would you like to have any? Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, but I would just like to say that again, if you're looking for a traditional kind of superhero, that's what you'll get within my books of Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes. The new book that's coming out, which is Crom the Destroyer, is more of trying to delve into those ancient ideas that I talked about, trying to go back to sort of a more modern, not so modern, but a Greek and older form of civilization, to see how those ideas would play out in the minds of people in that area. So that's where I go with my material. If you're looking for a story expression of what I have just talked about.
Certainly, I enjoyed this conversation, and if it, and everyone else, there will be more content like this going forward. I can't wait to release my edited video, long-awaited video on lying and why it is always wrong to lie. But until then, I hope that everyone has a wonderful day. This is William from Applied Virtue signing out. Thank you, everyone.